familiar faces joining us today. Just going to be putting everybody on mute so that we get rid of some of the background noise that the microphone will pick up. If you have any questions, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen here, you'll see a button that says chat, and that will open up a chat window, probably off to my side here. And feel free to enter any questions that you have into the chat box, and I'll try to incorporate as many questions as I can from all of you as we go along. And with that, I think we're about ready to get started. One last thing is I just wanted to thank our whole donor and subscriber family. Without you, we wouldn't be able to put on these wonderful operas. So we're so grateful for your support. My name's Alex Minami. I'm the Community Engagement Manager here at Seattle Opera. And with me today is Susan Davis, our Costume Director. And so I hope you all have been enjoying some of the videos that we've been putting up over the past few weeks. I know, Susan, you just did a video the other day where you talked about some of your favorite costumes and favorite productions. And so we're going to be digging in a little deeper to learn about the inner workings of our costume shop and how we go about creating these amazing costumes that you see on stage. Our first question is, Susan, just if you could tell us a little bit about how you got started in this career. It's such a unique industry to be in. You know, what sort of impelled you to get involved in the opera?
Sure. Great. Well, nice to see you all. Thanks for your interest and joining us this afternoon. Let's see. So how did I get into this business? It really came from a love of theater and a love of sewing. Those two interests really came together for me in college when I realized, oh, there is such a thing as a costume shop. So I managed to wrangle my way into a job my freshman year and sort of haven't looked back since. I started out on the making side, so you know, as one of the people in the workroom making costumes, and then worked my way into management, but I still am sort of a hands-on manager. And along the way, I honed my management skills by, with my a friend, Becky, we started a costume business, an independent costume shop, basically, as well as a retail line of historic undergarments that were that we designed to be used in a theater setting. And we learned about management and budgeting through doing that work, and that sort of came together for me in this position at the opera.
And remind me, you're from the East Coast, right?
I actually grew up, I lived in about 20 different places before moving to Seattle. I grew up overseas, actually, in Japan and Taiwan and Ethiopia and Egypt, but I've been in Seattle longer than I was in all those places.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure the Egypt background comes in handy with operas like Aida. And how did you find yourself here at Seattle Opera then?
Yeah, so in college, I was fortunate that the costume design professor there had a connection with another designer who was the resident designer at Lake George Opera Festival, one of the summer opera festivals. So between my freshman and sophomore year, I worked at Lake George Opera Festival, and so that sort of started me knowing about opera and loving opera. And so I worked at a number of different opera companies, including Santa Fe Opera. And while I was in Santa Fe, I was sort of deciding that I wanted to be closer to my sister who lived in Seattle. So I, on a whim, called the opera and applied for a position, and they said they didn't need me. And they called me next week and offered me a job because whoever they had offered it to first dropped out. So I moved to Seattle and have been here ever since.
Oh, wild.
Yeah.
I wonder what production it was that made them drop out, or they just took one look at it.
Uh,
No, no,
I
no.
don't know. It was the Marriage of Figaro, 1989. Michael Olich was the costume designer, wonderful designer. I think it was just, you know, something happened in their life. They had to withdraw. So lucky
Sure.
for me, I ended up here and, you know, have been with the opera on and off since then.
Wild. And for some of our long-term subscribers, what was the first production that you worked on here at Seattle Opera?
It was that Marriage of Figaro.
Oh, that's
1989,
right.
fall of 1989, Marriage of Figaro,
Okay.
followed by Dialogues of the Carmelites. And after that, we did War and Peace and lots of wonderful productions.
Right. Amazing. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how the costume shop is structured. What are some of the different roles in the costume
Sure,
shop?
yeah. So there are kind of three different components, I would say. One is the office staff. So those of us who are here year-round, working on all the projects, all the productions, all the displays, and so on. And, you know, I'm certainly doing pre-planning and budgeting and staffing and just taking kind of a longer view, as well as overseeing some of the day-to-day work like being in fittings and so on. And then there's the workroom team. So those are the folks who are actually making the costumes, and they are members of IATSE 887, so Theatrical Wardrobe Union 887, and they have different specialties. So there are the cutters, who are the pattern makers, essentially. They have assistants called first hands, and then stitchers round out the teams, the ones doing the sewing. Of course, when we get towards opening night, everybody in the workroom is sewing because that's the finishing work, the final touches, the trims, the buttons, and so on. And costumes crafts is part of the workroom. So that's the non-clothing elements, the footwear, the hats, the jewelry, the painting. And then the kind of third team is the wardrobe team. So those are the folks who are backstage for all on-stage rehearsals, dress rehearsals, and caring for the costumes between performances and between dress rehearsals. So those are kind of the three main sort of sets of workers.
Right. Could you walk us through, there's always like a flurry of activity happening in the costume shop, and even right up until opening night, you get one production up on stage, and then the next day you're already working on the next opera if you haven't already been working on the next opera. Could you give us a kind of a sketch from beginning to end of how these costumes reach the stage?
Sure. So
Or how we prepare for a production?
Yeah, there are many, 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 many steps. There's, of course, the planning at the, you know, artistic department level. What shows are we going to be doing in a season? A couple years out, some of that information flows to me, so I can look at that with a budgetary eye. And then when the season is settled and been announced, of course, then we're doing our more hands-on work. And so actually, Caroline has some slides that we can share about what happens when we're working on a new show through the shop. So there's the research and design process with the costume designer.
Mm-hmm.
You can just look at the workroom. What's happening? Yeah, so if you saw Beatrice and Benedict, you might remember it had some contemporary elements, but really through a period kind of a lens. And do you remember that production at all?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, good. And that was a great collaboration with ACT Theater because the piece involved actors, and our stage director is artistic director at ACT Theater. So that was a wonderful Seattle collaboration between two companies that don't typically work together.
And I think the music director, the former music director of Seattle Symphony, Ludovic Morleau, conducted it in person for that.
Right.
And it turned out that he's a huge Berlioz nerd.
Yeah, that was great. That was a really great collaboration in lots of ways. Our costume designer, Deb Trout, is from the Seattle area. She's a professor at the University of Washington. So that was really
That's right.
fortunate for us because she could come into the shop pretty often, even just for, 15 minutes to check on something, where when we have an out-of-town designer, we really have to pre-plan, consolidate all our questions into a pretty short period of time. So her early work is some of what Caroline is showing is, doing her sketches, talking with the director to see if she's headed in the right direction. And of course, there have been conversations at that point with all the design team about what time period are we setting the work, what is the season, maybe what are some color inspirations or scenery inspirations. These photos are from a little further on in the process, looking at some hats with our craftsperson, hats and wigs. There was quite a festive party scene, if you recall, where everyone is wearing these sort of masquerade looks, and there were lots of feathers, and so we were looking at some of those samples with Miriam, our craftsperson, at this point. So there's the sketching process. In this image, Deb and the designer or director were looking over what she had planned for the chorus in terms of the color palette. And Connie, who was the associate lighting designer, or actually was the lighting designer for that production, Connie Young, who works here on most shows, she came just to have a sense of the flavor of the show so she could keep that in mind as she was developing her lighting design.
Right, yes, that's always very important to sort of make these costumes pop on stage. It's not just a matter of the costumes themselves, but how they're lit.
Right, and typically in an opera setting, the set design is developed first. It's kind of a little further ahead than the costume design, and the costume design is developed, I mean, it's not so clearly step by step, but that's sort of the way, and then the lighting design last, kind of layered on top of what's been selected.
I see.
So there's the design process, then there's fabric selection, finding all the materials. All of that happens, of course, before we get into the workroom, and then we're developing patterns for the different shapes of garments and looking at samples with the designer, making adjustments before things are cut out in fabric. And I'm giving you the kind of truncated version, but that's basically what we're doing on most shows, even if it's something we purchased versus something we made new.
I see. I mean, each one of these steps, I imagine, can be a whole chapter unto themselves.
Absolutely, and I can go on about any,
or a book.
If there's a particular interest in a certain area, I can expand on that, absolutely.
And then once the costumes are, once the fabrics are chosen, the patterns are kind of figured out, what happens from that point on? Because there's so many things I feel like we have to take into consideration. We often double cast our operas. We have a huge chorus. Some operas have the full chorus. Some will just have, half of the chorus or no chorus. And then we have the performance run themselves.
Right. So each show really has a similar arc in terms of all the different phases. And a lot of them are calendar driven because we know when our chorus are going to start their music rehearsals, and that's typically when we start our fittings on the chorus. And of course, our chorus live in the Seattle area, so we have sort of fewer restrictions than our guest artists who are coming from out of town. And then we know when our first staging rehearsal is going to start, so that's when the director is in town, the choreographer if there is one, and of course our principal singers. So we can't fit them before they get here. Right. So we always are really driven by that date, and any new costumes that we're going to make, for our principals, we know we have 1 week basically that we try to fit everything on the principals regardless of the size of the show. And then we have 2 weeks for finishing work. And then we start our dress rehearsal process and have that 1 week. And then we're at opening night. So that schedule, when we see the singers for the first time, drives how we schedule everything else and how early we're able to start or need to start on the chorus and the supers and the dancers and the actors or who all the other performers. Yeah.
Well, that got me thinking. I just remembered for our last production of Carmen, when one of our lead tenors, he was only able to, I think, perform once for one of the shows before he fell ill and wasn't able to complete the run, and we had to fly in Freddie Ballantyne from Berlin with 1 day's notice, and
Yes.
all of the staging and get a whole new costume ready in time for, I think he went on for the dress rehearsal the next day.
Yeah, he did an amazing job stepping into that, didn't he?
He did, yes.
Nailed it on opening night. We were holding our breath because he was staging rehearsal. So thankfully he'd been with us before for a couple of productions. So we had some measurements of him. We knew where he had sung recently at Washington National Opera, and they had taken some great photos of him. So they sent us those. They sent us some updates. Thankfully there were some, existing pieces that came with that production that fit on him. There were some, that production had some purchased pieces, like purchased blue jeans and, leather jacket that was purchased for Don Jose. So we were able to pull together and, have some things shopped. We actually did some in-town shopping, ready to try on him as soon as, I think the first thing he did was come into the fitting room. Usually in that case, they just figure they're too tired and dehydrated from flying to sing, so let's get him into the fitting.
Right.
Yeah.
At least he can do that. Yep. Stand there and be measured.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Yes, that brings back some memories. And then what happens during a run itself? What involvement does the costume shop have from that point? Because each production, I'm sure there's something that happens that needs to be fixed, or there's some costume changes, or.
Right. So most of the costume shop's involvement to getting us to the stage ends when we get to opening night. So during the week before, when we're finally moved into the theater, Russ and his team have loaded in, even a few days before that, and got us all set up to have what we call our piano tech rehearsal, which is just a handful of characters in costume on the Sunday before opening. So a week before you see it. In the evening dress rehearsals, a handful of key people from the costume shop attend those rehearsals to really check in with the performers and also look at how things look from the house, particularly if something is painted with distressing, so some kind of aging technique. We come out into the house and see, our painter can see if the paint levels are right and check in with the designer, or do we have more wear and tear on Don Jose's leather jacket, or is it reading right? And that's really then when the wardrobe crew is backstage, making sure everything's smooth running from the back end of things. And opening night is really when the show is handed over to wardrobe, and Carrie, the wardrobe head, and her team are taking care of it from there on. Now, it used to be we had actually a lot more separation because we were across town from the performance hall. And of course, now we're right next door, which is beautiful because we don't have to sort of second guess all the extra supplies that will be needed. If Carrie runs out of, I don't know, she needs another, medium man's t-shirt, then she can just walk over from McCaw Hall through the magic doors, as we call them, and, pick up extra supplies. We used to just keep a lot of extra supplies at the theater because they wouldn't be able to easily access the costume shop.
Right, yes. Moving into this.
they're really taking care of the show and keeping it looking, you know, as good on closing night as it does on opening night. And if there's something major that happens that they can't address, then they'll come over and check in with me and say, you know, is there somebody available who can do this more major repair, or you know, we actually need to take these pants in a couple of inches. This person lost a lot of weight quickly or something. And yeah, but they really take charge of it and make it look good.
What are some of the situations that might happen on stage? I mean, things that are sort of built into the story of the opera. For example, you know, a violent scene where there's blood or something. What are some of the situations in a story that might present some particular challenges for the costume?
Right. Well, if you remember in the most recent Carmen, in the last scene, Don Jose rips Carmen's dress in a few different pieces. And so those pieces are, you know, secured onto the garment, hopefully enough that they stay on as long as they're supposed to, but not so securely that they don't come off when they're supposed to. So that's always something like that is nerve-wracking, because you know, you really don't want something to fall off before it's supposed to, and so it trips up a singer when they weren't meant to be, you know, right, actually trips them as opposed to staging trips them. So there's definitely that comes to mind. Yeah.
Okay. And any other situations where the costumes might get damaged or
Well, La Cenerentola, everybody remember that really fun Cenerentola we just did, and the prince and Don Ramiro were on their knees all the time.
right, yes.
Falling on their knees, sliding on their knees, being silly on their knees, you know, being romantic on their knees. And they were wearing, if you might recall, red velvet suits. So the knees of those suits just took such a beating, and you know, we could reinforce as much as we could, but there were still had to be repaired every night. Yeah, wow. There wasn't really anything we could do about that. It was just the nature of as active as that scene, you know, as that opera was. And I mean, it was so great. It was really fun. Beautiful staging, but the clothes took a beating.
We're getting a few questions here in our chat thread. The first one I see is when productions, this was one of the questions I was going to ask you anyway. When productions move from different opera companies, do the costumes move as well? That's becoming more typical in the opera world, right? To have these co-productions. So could you tell us a little bit about the role that we play if we're kind of bringing in a set of costumes from another company?
Yeah, so typically most of our shows, maybe 4 out of 5 shows, we actually bring in from other companies, whether we're renting just the costumes and maybe the scenery we're creating, or sometimes we're renting the costumes and the scenery together from a company. In the case of Yardbird, we rented the costumes and the scenery from another company. In other instances, we we go in on co-production. So that's a way for companies to share resources to bring a new work to the stage for all of you. And sometimes we're what's called the originating company. That means we're the first ones to produce it. We're building everything in-house here. And that's, of course, the most fun for the shop, to be able to make new things. Mm-hmm. But we're renting a show or even remounting a show that we own, we always have new costumes that we have to build, because either something has worn out, or it doesn't fit the singer, or maybe the director realizes, you know what, that particular costume really didn't work for some reason, and so we might be asked to provide a new design for a new costume. So you know, we get creative and reuse costumes from other shows and kind of give them new identities, as Yeva knows well. I see Yeva here, our costume rental stock coordinator.
Is Yeva here? Hi, Yeva.
Yep. So she knows. I'll go and ask her. Sometimes I'll ask her and sometimes I'll tell her, and she likes the first rather than the second. So I might say, you know, oh, remember that set of chorus dresses we have from XYZ? We really want to reuse them and retrim them, and they'll fit into this new show. And she'll say, great idea. We're not renting that show anymore. Or she'll say, ooh, that's going to be tricky when we rent out Figaro. We'll have to take that trim off and turn those back into Rosencavalier maids. So we get pretty creative with that work just to make sure we're, you know, using our resources in the best way and putting on the best show we can.
Yeah, fascinating. There's another question here in the chat box. This is probably going back to our section when we were talking about what the wardrobe department does during the production. What has been the most dramatic wardrobe malfunction we've seen on stage?
Well, I don't go to every performance, so some of them I think are kept secret from me. So I don't know that I really know, but I know there have been a couple of times where, you know, a gentleman ripped out his pants and had to run off and have it, you know, sewn up quickly before the next scene. So
right.
That definitely.
The nice thing is you guys are pros.
Ones. Say again?
Sure. Nobody would notice from the audience if anything goes wrong.
I hope not. We try not.
David says it's the codpiece incident from Counterie.
Oh my gosh, yes, that was terrible. That was a dress rehearsal, right? Tell me it was a dress rehearsal.
Yes, it was.
Yes, the codpiece came untied and was just flopping around in a dramatic fashion.
Oh no.
Exposed. I mean, it just was in keeping with the campy humor of that production.
Yeah, that's true. It would just sort of fit in with the rest of the show, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but something, not necessarily a malfunction, but just thinking about, you know, all the activity that's going on that you don't see while you're seeing all the activity that is going on in Cinderella. Towards the end of the opera, it's right before the Prince and Cinderella are getting married, and all kinds of people run into the store, right? There were two, into the store, and the scenery closed up and turned around, and I think about 8 people were upstairs in this tiny little space, and the prince was changing out of his Dandini costume into his wedding costume, and Angelina, Cinderella, is changing out of her, you know, rags to her riches, and they have their hair and makeup team in there, they have their wardrobe team, hopefully they have access to some water bottles to get a sip of water before their final aria where they're singing and dancing.
Right.
And that was quite an amazing choreography, and her dress was not that little, if you recall.
Yes.
Took a lot of space. Yeah.
Oh
that
my goodness.
was a whole opera in itself going on in the scenery.
And there are even some costume changes happening right there on stage for the audience to see, as I recall.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I forgot about how many different costumes. I mean, Cinderella, I think, had 3.
She had 3, yeah.
If I recall.
And the prince had 3, yeah.
Wild. Could you tell us a little bit more about just how the costumes are made? So when you work with the costume designer, what sort of guidance you get? I know that there are these things called the costume sketches that kind of give you the concept for it, but what happens from that point?
Yeah, so they come together in a lot of different ways, but if we're making new from a costume sketch, it also depends on the designer. If they have a technical background, they'll have more thoughts about how something is realized, and these are some sketches from Beatrice and Benedict.
All right.
So maybe just scroll a couple more, Caroline, see if there's, or actually go back. Go back a few more. Just to find Beatrice, wherever she is. Yeah, there she is. So, oh yeah, there we go. So looking at this sketch, the designer will, when they've drawn it, will have some ideas. We knew that we were going to be buying this blouse, but we were going to be building the skirt and the sash. So when Deb and I met with Shayna, the cutter who worked on this, we, talked about the fullness of the skirt, and we looked at the fabric that was selected and talked about what kind of petticoat it might require. And was that a petticoat we had in stock, or did we need to build a petticoat or add to a petticoat we already had? We had purchased a blouse, which needed a little modification to look closer to the sketch. For some sketches, we're also asking the designer about the back view, because if it's something with a train or there's a case where you don't see the details in the sketch, then we are wanting to know, what does the back look like? And they'll just do a rough sketch while we're talking, just maybe to the side of the main drawing.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
A question that came up here in the chat box is, when we buy pieces of the costume, oh, it disappeared. Let's see if I can bring it back here. What are some of the places that we go to source pieces of the costume that we're purchasing?
Sure. So it sort of depends on what, on the production itself. So when we did Katia Kabanova, the Czech opera that we did a few seasons ago, it was set in the early 50s, and we did some sourcing at some vintage clothing shops in Seattle. So when
Oh, wow.
the designer was in town, we, went to all the vintage shops. Maybe if any of you are fans of vintage wear, you've been to some of them. I'm not going to remember the names offhand, but there are a handful in Ballard and in the district. And so we went to those places and found some pieces particularly for the ensemble supers in that production. In Beatrice and Benedict, all the soldiers wore tailored blue jackets with red and gold trim, but they wore them with blue jeans, with skinny jeans and boots. And so we picked a few different online vendors like Levi's.com and ordered sort of fit samples of their jeans, as well as I think some Lee jeans, and then compared the fit and saw what worked best for our chorus with the movement they had to do and which jeans would tuck into the boots appropriately. And also, all of you know, if you wear blue jeans, like some brands fit you better than others. So we couldn't pick one brand and stick with it. We wanted to make sure everyone looked as good as they could in whatever we were providing. So that, so that was pretty straightforward. Sometimes we just order from Nordstrom or go into Nordstrom and choose men's dress shirts, for example.
All right.
So it's kind of a range of places.
Okay. And then when we go into actually creating a new costume, how do we go about that? Do we have a whole collection of patterns sitting around that we use to base dresses off of, or 18th century frocks, or?
Yeah, so we do have a lateral file full of patterns that we've used in the past, and we reference those for some things. We definitely look at those. A lot of times we're working with a design that is something unconventional, like think of Count Ori. Some of those costumes were not really like anything we had seen on our stage before. So those patterns were developed individually for the particular singers that they were designed for.
I see. We have a question about the production Semele from, when was that? 2015, I want to say.
Yeah.
Thereabouts. And the costumes in that one were pretty elaborate. The question is, was there anything particular? Did anything particular stand out for you from that production?
Oh yeah, that show was really fun to work on. I think mainly because we collaborated a lot with our friends in the electrics department, which is rare for us. Usually we don't interact nearly as much, but if you recall, the cloak that Somnus wore had some LED lights in it, these constellations, And
Yeah.
and we so we need to figure out which components, you know, what kinds of hardware would make the effects that the costume designer Vita Tsikun wanted. And what was great benefit to us on that show was she often is a scenery designer also, so she just had some other knowledge that we didn't have necessarily in the costume shop workroom, you know, to kind of figure out, because she'd collaborated more as a set designer with lighting designers and
Right.
lighting technicians and so on, so she could bring that in. Yeah.
And how does that work to light up a dress like that? Do you carry a battery somewhere in the dress?
Right. Yeah, there were actually a series of batteries that were then wired together by our friends Jim and Martin in the electric shop. Our head electrician Jim Nash and his colleague Martin. And yeah, and then we had to figure out, you know, how often did the batteries need to get changed? Who changed them? You know, there is also that conversation we have certainly in the backstage setting of whose work is it, because we have a few different unions, and some work is clearly the work of a props person versus an electrician versus a wardrobe person. And sometimes that's a conversation that we have to have, like, oh, the fans, oh my gosh, Eugene Onegin, the fans came as props with the scenery that came from Atlanta, but, and I know I'm going tangential to your question, but I think it's still interesting.
Yes.
So the fans came with props. Typically at Seattle Opera, fans are what we call run as wardrobe pieces. So they're run as costumes, meaning they're in our department. And so we just had a conversation with props, you know, oh, does it make sense because we want the fans to match the costumes? So we're going to assign them, so they'll be a costume piece and they'll run on the wardrobe paperwork and be tracked through wardrobe as opposed to tracked through the props department. So that maybe just shows you some of the collaborations that we do. You know, we may seem like distinct departments, but we have a lot of crossover.
Right. And what's sort of the dividing line between whether it's a costume or a prop? I remember, I think you were telling me about another example was like if there's a pistol in a holster, the pistol is a prop, but the holster is a costume, or I might have got it wrong, but.
No, that's correct. Sometimes it just depends on if the item is, you know, worn like a garment, or if the item actually never goes into or onto the costume, that would be more likely to be a prop. Like
I see.
In Don Giovanni, you know, there's always this money bag that gets thrown between Don Giovanni and his wonderful sidekick, whose name I can't remember, Leporello.
Leporello, yeah.
You know, but it never actually goes into a pocket, so it's just always a prop, and it has the money, and they throw the money or whatever they do with the money. But it's not a costume piece. Whereas if the money needed to live in the pouch and the pouch needed to be on the belt, then it might be a costume piece.
Okay. A mask?
But the money would still be a prop.
Is a mask, I guess if a mask is worn, so that would be a costume then as well.
That's right, yeah.
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 Wild. Okay, let me just.
On the one hand, it might sound like, you know, who even cares? Well, we care because actually when we get to the theater, we need to know that everything that is in the show is there, and who is going to make sure that it's there, and who's going to take care of it if it's broken or missing, right? We just need to know the whole list. And so we decide who owns which part of the list.
Right, exactly. It's like, I never cease to be amazed just the amount of organizational effort that needs to go into each production, and how each tiny little detail matters a lot in the final production. Let's
Right.
see. Have I
And we
missed
have a
any?
lot of templates and, ways to track that information. We're not starting from scratch every time. We're just populating
Right.
different kinds of lists with different sorts of information.
There was a question about rentals, whether we rent costumes to other opera companies.
Yeah, we rent whole shows, we rent individual pieces. We rent out maybe 5 to 10 shows a year to other opera companies, maybe a little bit less than that. It really varies because it depends on if the company who is doing a show that we actually have the costumes for, right? There just needs to be a need, and we don't drive that need. It's what does that company want to show on their stage? And then we also do a lot of what we call mini rentals in town, and these are the most aggravating for Yeva. And also the most gratifying because we're helping our neighbors in town. So that might be renting a handful of costumes to the University of Washington for one of their graduate students, senior productions. It might be when the ballet did Carmina Burana, that has some singers,
Mhm.
and the singers needed to have a certain kind of a sandal. Well, it wasn't a ballet shoe. It was, a singer needs a sort of rustic looking sandal. Well, it turns out one of the singers was Glenn Gore, who's in our chorus, and oh no, it was Craig Grayson, I think. Anyway, they came over and
Or Glenn. I think it was Glenn.
was it Glenn? Yeah, good. So the ballet said, could we rent some rustic sandals from you? And we said, have we got rustic sandals? So they came over and looked through the box and, found the pair that actually had Glenn's name on them. And so they borrowed us. I mean, we didn't charge for that. There's within reason. That was just a favor, and they would do the same for us.
Right. We have an enormous shoe collection.
But never exactly the right one sometimes.
It goes on and on all the way up to the ceiling. I don't even know how you reach the ones up to the top.
There's a staircase.
Yes.
A mezzanine with a staircase access.
Right. Let's see, what were some of the other questions I had here? I know this is a question that gets asked often of you, but what have been some of your most favorite productions to work on?
I like them all. The ones that we make new are really the most fun, where we're really involved in the process from the concept development through the design process and really creative problem solving to make sure we can match the budget that we're trying to match. It's the most creative for the people in the workroom. So, productions like Nabucco, like Count Ori, even the Katia Kabanova, even though that wasn't, big giant gowns and beautiful three-piece suits or something like that. It had its own set of, the research that we had to do to really make it feel like a certain time and a place in the United States. And so that involved a lot of research, which is really interesting. And then trying to make sure we translate that into the costume in a way that it translates to the audience. Because of course we have to look through the lens of our performance venue, which means even if we're making something historically accurate, so to speak, it isn't really exactly, because it is, the design is adjusted and the approach to how we make it needs to make sense in McCall.
Right. And how does that research work? What are some of the resources that we turn to find out how a piece of clothing might have been made in a certain time period?
Yeah, so the internet, of course, gives us lots of access to all sorts of images. A lot of museums have their collections online. So, the designer is doing some of that research, but then also the cutters who are the ones making the patterns also have the opportunity to do that research. So some of it is provided to them by the designer. Like, I love this painting from so-and-so. This is kind of the flavor of what I'm not holding anything up, but you know, they might point to a particular painting and say, this is what it should feel like when it's finished. And then the cutter uses their, you know, ingenuity to make that happen, you know, based on the understructure they choose and the fabrics and their approach to the cut. So, but we also have a lot of books. We have quite a beautiful library in our design studio here that some of them are costume history books, some are art books, some are photos from collections. So, yeah, there, that shows you. This is our beautiful design studio. So we have also have our fabric swatches stored here, but then lots of different costume history books that are from different museum costume collections, and yeah, so those are all good references.
Are the fabrics that we use accurate to the time period, or accurate to the type of clothing that they are? Or?
Sometimes they are, yeah. I'm thinking really way back when we did in the 90s, Marty Pacladina's designed a Bohème for us that we produced several times, and he really wanted to capture a certain heaviness of wool cloth that really doesn't exist for the most part in any kind of variety today, because, you know, we have heated houses and heated cars, and we don't have to, you know, chop wood and live in a drafty stone house, right? So we don't wear wool that's super, super thick. So a handful of the costumes in that show, we actually were built with, you know, 2 layers of wool to kind of really get that feeling, and that, yeah, to recreate something that doesn't really exist anymore. Other fabrics like silk taffeta is very similar to what silk taffeta has been since there's been silk taffeta, and we can order that right out of the books. So it runs the range, but we definitely have, you know, there are fewer mills in this country. I mean, we know sort of about fast fashion and how fashion is manufactured or not manufactured in the United States. So the same thing, we don't really have the kinds of mills that we used to have, which means less variety in materials that are available.
I see. Wow. I mean, that would never have even occurred to me that one type of fabric would have changed over time.
Yeah. So we get our, you know, we get a lot of our silks, kind of the basic silks, but also some of the more decorative ones come from India. They're all made in India, whether they come through vendors in New York or LA, but they're basically from factories in India. A lot of our wools actually still come from England, and we sometimes order direct from them, which is strangely more cost effective than trying to find that fabric in a, you know, in a New York fabric store. And yeah, so
wild.
You know, been known for their woolens for a long time, and they still are.
I just spent 2 weeks in Scotland last summer, and they have no shortage of sheep. There's an endless supply of wool in Britain.
Right.
A question from the chat box is about the ring. Are there any ring costume stories that come to mind?
Yeah, see, I almost said the ring when the question was asked about a favorite production. But I wasn't sure if people were tired of talking about the green ring or not.
Oh, I guess not. Oh, we've got,
yeah, good. Well,
got some questions about it.
I have a long history with that production and that designer, Martin Pacladina's. One of the, oh, actually, you can see over my shoulder this sketch here.
Right.
The sketch from a production of the Coconuts that I did at Arena Stage. I was maybe 2 years out of college, and Marty was the designer, and that was my first time working with him, and he gifted me a beautiful sketch from that. So we go way back. And when between my 2 periods of time working at the opera, when I was running my own business, we were one of the companies that some of the ring work was subcontracted to. So my business, Kaufman Davis Studio, built the costumes for Brunhilde and for the Rhine Maidens. So just being involved from the ground up with developing the Rhine Maiden costumes was just amazing process. And my studio was down in the Soto neighborhood, and Marty, when he was in town, would stop somewhere, pick up donuts, and we'd pick up donuts and flowers from the market, put them on his bicycle, and ride down to our studio. And then we'd, have our meetings with looking at mock-ups or, sample fins. How are we going to get those Rhine Maiden fins to stay upright when they were turning upside down and keep the illusion of swimming? And yeah, that was pretty wonderful.
Right. And I think we also made the legs, I guess they're called, the is that the right term? The curtains from the green ring?
Yes, so hanging at the
now
now in the stairwell is the show curtain. I mean, any kind of special curtain, I guess we would just call a show. So that show curtain was designed specifically, and it was built by our scenic studios at the time, incorporating some of the fabrics from the costumes and certainly all the full palette of textures and colors that were in the ring. Because if you remember, there's all the kind of earthy characters, Albericht and Fafner and Fasselt and so on. And then, all the way to the sort of royalty in Gibbikland with all the purple and silver costumes. So that whole range of, just rustic to extremely formal.
Right. I'm scrolling up here and I see a question that I missed from earlier. It was about the budget. What kind of budget do we work with in the costume shop, and what are some of the things that might affect the budget for particular
product? Yeah, the budgets are extremely varied. You can imagine a show like Charlie Parker's Yardbird, where there's not a chorus on stage. It's very minimalist and a lot of purchased clothing, to something like The Ring, where each piece was really custom made. So there are so many factors that go into the budgets. The main thing really is the setting, the time period, and the number of people, and even more, the number of costumes in the production.
What's the most expensive time period?
Well, I mean, I guess, The Ring with its fantasy land, that was
yes,
a sort of real place, but it certainly was inspired by some very specific images, from medieval times and so on, and from some particular artists. I mean, any costume that is just bigger, like it has a train or it has a cloak or it has many layers, is going to be more expensive because it's more pieces to build, it's more fabric. I mean, the labor is really, of course, the biggest expense. And then there are lots of other expenses that you wouldn't really maybe think about, like the dry cleaning and maintenance between shows and when the show is finished, the footwear, if particularly in time periods where you can see the shoes, like a lot of 20th century, right, where the shoes really show the time period. If somebody had on some 70s go-go boot with their 1950s street dress, it just wouldn't look right. So we definitely have to get the footwear right in those sorts of shows. And 18th century too, those are very particular shoes that we often see when the men have knee breeches on. And then there are other expenses like archive photos. So when we have a brand new production, we want to make sure that we are documenting, along with our paperwork inventory, that we have a photo of each costume. So we hire a photographer to come in and work with Yeva to, line up all the singers as we can between their times on stage, so we can get a really good picture of what those clothes look like in show conditions, what it looks like when it's completely done and we're in production.
Okay.
I don't know the exact dollar amount, but really the dollar amount is so varied, and it has a lot of components that go into it.
Right. We've got about 4 minutes left. We have time for maybe one more question. Oh, one just came up. How heavy was Queen Elizabeth's dress in Mary Stuart?
Oh my gosh, yes.
When was that?
That is a
2014?
good question. It had quite a firm support farthingale to keep it standing out as it did. And I don't know, Yev, I'm gonna have you nod if it was maybe 8 pounds, 5 pounds, 15 pounds, 20 pounds. So, it's funny, we joke about it, but we never actually have had a singer, okay, step on the scale before you get dressed and then after to really see. But certainly there are, the more voluminous it is, usually the heavier it is. The costumes that we rented from Europe for Cinderella were extremely heavy, and it was not, we had to make some extra costumes, and we did not recreate their construction style because we were able to achieve the same look without so much weight. So we just were more, maybe we had different materials available to us or something, because we definitely don't want to burden our singers. They have enough to think about with, their blocking and their singing and watching Maestro and, making their way across the stage without also having to have the burden of us giving them, too many pounds to add.
Singers ever say, no way, I can't wear this. It's too heavy. I can't sing.
No, that has not happened. We have made modifications, like Intro Vittori. One of the singers just ran, some people's temperature just runs hotter, right? They just, well, that's a terrible connotation these days, but some people are just warmer and some people are colder, right? You just know that from yourself. Do you wear wool socks all year round like me, or do you like to wear sandals and that's more comfortable? So we adjust where we can. Like, do we ever see the shirt sleeves? No, the coat is always on. So we can provide a shirt with no sleeves just to take one part of the layer out,
I see.
So we appreciate being able to work with our singers and help them help them do their best, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in the 1 minute we have left, I was wondering, you're currently in the Opera Center right now. You're one of the few people that are still actually going into the building. Could you tell us a little bit about what the costume shop has been working on for the last few weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. So when the pandemic really hit in our area and our stay-at-home order was put in effect, a lot of different people from a lot of related industries were asking how they could help out this need for PPE, for personal protective equipment, which I know we all now know that word that we didn't maybe know before. And so Providence St. Joseph Health System basically created a supply chain for themselves to have masks for their healthcare workers. So 3 people who would have been working on Bohem with us were hired by Providence to sew masks from materials provided by the hospital. So they're cut from hospital grade materials, and we are making masks. And just this afternoon, I've been adding to the count as we box things up, because we're boxing them in groups of 300. So we just hit over 10,000 masks today. Yay!
Oh, whoa, well done.
Yeah, so that's 3 people working for just almost 4 weeks. Tomorrow will be 3 weeks and 4 days. And weeks, I mean work weeks, 5-day weeks. And so we're making about 600 masks a day in the shop. Yeah.
Wow.
So tomorrow will be the last day on the project, because some bigger supply chains have been established, places that can, turn out thousands a day. And But we were so delighted to be able to, one, offer, have some work for some folks who aren't working right now, and also help out in this really important need.
Right. And I know I speak for everybody on the staff that we're so proud to work for a company that's been able to contribute to the cause in this way.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I feel like I can keep talking to you about costumes forever, and I'm sure people would love to keep listening. I just wanted to thank all of our donors and subscribers who are listening and who aren't listening for all of their support. We hope you've been enjoying these videos. We've done several over the past week, and stay tuned for an announcement for next week. We'll have a special guest from the Seattle Symphony joining us, Seattle Symphony bassoonist Paul Raffanelli. With that, I just wanted to thank you, Susan, for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed all of your questions and being able to share with you what we do here in the costume shop. So thank you, and thanks for your support.
Of course. All right. We'll see you next week, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.